Hello. Today I'd like to speak with you about European expansion in Asia and Africa and the extent to which it influenced diplomacy. It's always easiest if we start off with things being simple and then we try to make them a little more complicated. So in a very simple sense, when we're thinking about European expansion in Africa, we would want to start with the Berlin Conference in February of 1885. When the conference concludes, it has established certain protocols that will need to be followed for the expansion of European colonies and possessions in Africa. This then is widely considered to set off the scramble for Africa, and it's going to lead to a series of crises and a series of conflicts, and really a competition between the great powers to divide up Africa. And this will come to a pinnacle in 1898, in the summer of 1898, when we have the Fashoda Crisis. And in the Fashoda Crisis, there is a sort of showdown between British forces and French forces in Sudan. And the conflict here then is over who will get to have legitimate claim to the area. The British end up being victorious in that the French back down. And this can sort of feel as though then the scramble for Africa has been resolved. The great conflict was going to be whether the French were going to build a railroad from east to west, or whether the British were going to be able to colonize from north to south. And if you look at a map there, you can see the ways in which their colonies are aligned in those two competing X and Y axes. How did the scramble for Africa affect European diplomacy? The most simple thing we could say is that it brought the British and French into a conflict that almost led to war, but ultimately was resolved. And finally, we would say then that the Fashoda Crisis isn't truly resolved until the Entente cordiale in 1904, when we have the British and French agree about their respective possessions in Africa and Asia. So there is then, we could say there's a 20-year-long rivalry which is created between the British and the French because of the beginnings of the Berlin Conference, but it's finally resolved in 1904. All right, that's a fairly simple story of history and the way that it affects diplomacy. If we turn our attention to Asia, I would like to start our Asian conversation, at least our simplified Asian conversation, also in 1904, but going back to February, with the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War when the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. This conflict in Asia and this Russian expansion into Asia, which ultimately instigates or at least encourages the Japanese to attack them, sets off a series of diplomatic changes. Most notably, it's going to, just a few months later, influence the Entente cordiale between France and Britain. Not wanting to get into a conflict that their allies are in, with Russia allied with France and Japan allied with Great Britain, this drives them together. So in some sense then, we could say a conflict in Asia solves a conflict in Africa. Also though, this leads to a diplomatic realignment among Russia and Great Britain. After Russia loses the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, the British and Russians are able to reach an agreement in 1907 having to do with the Asian possessions in Persia and sort of the route going overland to India. So the Russo-Japanese War then also solves another piece of tension for the British. And really then it answers what I think is a fundamental question that I'd like you to hold on to. If imperialism, if European expansion was so important, why did the three great imperial powers of Britain, France and Russia end up on the same side in the Great War? To answer that question, we need to take this big, simple view, Conference of Berlin, Russo-Japanese War, diplomatic realignment. We need to take that and we need to look at it in much greater depth. And if we're interested in why the three great powers all ended up on the same side of the war, then we might be encouraged to ask, what else is happening? What are the other events that are going to guide the great powers moving forward? And of course, if Britain and France and Russia all end up on the same side of the Great War, we'll be very interested in who ends up on the other side. Maybe a better question is, how on earth did Germany end up on the wrong side of this great power conflict? Now, to answer this question, we can turn ourselves back to Africa if we want. We can talk about the ways in which Germany, beginning with the Kruger Telegram in 1896, and then ultimately when the Boer War breaks out in 1899, takes an ambiguous stance, which is really upsetting to the British. So already we can see some origins of Anglo-German tension in Africa as early as 1896 with the Kruger Telegram. But it's difficult to see exactly how that insult could possibly lead to a world war where they were on opposing sides. So I'm not sure how compelling the Kruger Telegram is as a cause of conflict, although we could certainly add it in as part of the steps which are needed to bring Britain and Germany into conflict. But I think the real source of conflict between Britain, France, Russia, the real source of conflict is going to be in Asia. And in Asia, at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, the great rivalry is between Britain and Russia. And in 1900, on October 6th, Britain and Germany signed the Yangtze River Agreement. And the Yangtze River Agreement promises to maintain the status quo in the Yangtze River Valley. Well, just a few months later in December, a concession in Tientsin, far north of the Yangtze River, is granted to Russia. The British seek out support from the Germans, who have signed the Yangtze Agreement with them. The Germans say that they're not interested in backing this British claim to hegemony over the Yangtze River when it's not the Yangtze River, which Tientsin isn't. And so this creates a tension, again, a small moment. But it's very shortly after this, just in November of the next year, 1901, when the final talks of some sort of an Anglo-German alliance break down. And at the same time, there's a very influential article published in the National Review, which is just called British Foreign Policy. But this influential article argues that what is needed in British foreign policy is a turning away from Germany as a potential ally, and instead a turning to the solving of the tension with Russia and the tension with France. So the idea is that right after the collapse of these negotiations, we see influential British people begin to imagine the alignment which will in fact take place in the First World War. And that becomes very interesting to us because if we think it's kind of unpredictable in 1901 that Britain and Germany would end up fighting against each other with Russia and France all on Britain's side, that seems unlikely. The fact that people were talking about a similar alignment in 1901 should set off some alarm bells for us. And then, thanks to the research of some very meticulous scholars, we're able to find out that in fact, that draft of that article, before it was published, was given to, read over, and approved by a young British politician whose name is Sir Edward Grey, who will go on to be the foreign minister during the First World War. So this gives us more sense of, oh, this really is an important moment. And so perhaps you might feel like we are overstating the claim, that we're overstating the significance of the Yangtze River Agreement or the British Foreign Policy article. But the key thing that I would like to suggest you do in your essay, when you write about the Russo-Japanese War, when you write about the Berlin Conference, is you want to weave them together. What's happening in Africa really, really matters for what's happening in Asia. And what's happening in Asia really, really matters for what's happening in Africa. And the key to tying this all together is the Suez Canal, which is purchased by the British from the Egyptians in 1875. From that moment forward, the pathway to Asia runs through Africa, and the British are committed to it. The British knew that the two were tied together, and so we should trust them on that. So all of the responses that you give about imperialism in Asia and in Africa, I really recommend making the argument that they're actually related. And I think this is something that sometimes gets lost, Asia felt more important to everyone who was interacting with Asia than Africa felt. Asia was already wealthy. Africa was not. Asia was clearly growing in population and would be a wonderful market and a wonderful provider of labor. There wasn't. Africa was much more valued for its raw materials and our ability to extract things, like we see the Belgians doing in the Congo. So if you're able to tie these things together in your argument, that's going to lead to a much stronger response. And then when you come forward and you talk about the Moroccan crisis in March of 1905, remember the Moroccan crisis comes about because of the Anglo-French Entente, which comes about because of the Russo-Japanese War. So we end up having this connection between Asia and Africa again in 1905. And then we'll have a similar connection which moves forward when we have the Agadir Crisis in 1911. Again and again and again, I'm reminded of what Bismarck said, which was that my map of Africa is here. And he points to the map of Europe. But I think it's a much better metaphor to think of the map of Asia and the map of Africa being set on top of each other. And that's where the real interplay is going on. And then that plays out in Europe. And so, after the French and the Russians team up with the British, which is to a large extent because the British and the French are able to give loans to the Russians, which they only needed in the degree that they needed because they lost the Russo-Japanese War, which happened in Asia because Britain's ally Japan defeated Russia with British training and British funding. Because of that, we see a total realignment of the diplomatic structure in Europe. And we start to see the sides that are going to exist in Europe forming. And we can see that as early then as we start to see that interaction between Asia and Africa, which might really just be with the Suez Canal. So I encourage you to think about that connection between the two and not to see them as separate, but to see them as united together, working in concert with each other to help you climb towards the war that you're going to get in 1914.